Chapter 10. The Iron Islands. Wrinkling her nose as she walked around the castle that she now called home, Olenna Lannister couldn't help but think about how much of a downgrade this place was compared to the castle at Airedale. Airedale had paled in comparison to Casterly Rock, but it was nothing compared to the cesspit that she now called her home. Brother would think of her now, the last true Lannister standing. Perhaps he would then see her worth, that she had been worthy of his attention and his respect, that it was through her that their house would survive after everyone else had failed. Tyrion and the two Hill bastards that had been fathered by Jaime with Cersei were not Lannisters as far as Olenna was concerned. She refused to see them as such after they had betrayed her family. Stopping by a window, Olenna tried to control the rage that she felt as she thought of her own family that had turned on her, that Arthur and Destin were now lost to her, because they had sided with their sister. It was because of Rhaenyra that she had lost everything. Her useless daughter couldn't even die right, and instead had caused the downfall of all of Olenna's house. The news that Rhaenyra now had two healthy sons and a third child on the way was not endearing to Olenna, who hoped to see her daughter suffer for all the perceived slights against her. Not even the news that Arthur had his own family, two sons, now seemed to reach her. She couldn't bring herself to, especially when her eldest betrayed her and sided with his sister. Olenna couldn't wait to see their faces, hear their pleas when they realized that she had come out on top, that they were all at her mercy and they had to dance along to whatever song she sang from now on. That if they had done as she wished in the first place, that all would be well and they would have been safe. Instead, they had betrayed her house and had cast it down to ruin. Rhaenyra would have found herself as Joffrey's queen. She would have all the power that she had now amassed and would have seen her children as the true rulers of the realm, rather than the upstarts that they were now. Arthur would have married a fine match from the Reach, and Destin would have been her darling boy, by her side for the rest of her days. The doors to the chamber opened, snapping Olenna from her thoughts of victory, so sweet that she could almost taste it, and she turned to the two soldiers that had entered. "What is it?" Olenna demanded. She had not been expecting any interruptions today, and she knew that the fleet was still being rebuilt after Yara had stolen it from under Euron, while he was being coronated. Olenna had thrilled at the idea. She was a queen now equal to that of her disobedient daughter, who complained herself as queen in the north, queen of the Trident and queen of the Vale. "You have been summoned," one of the guards stated, his face covered in a helmet so that she couldn't see, nor that of the other guard that was with him. His voice was gruff and revealed nothing more. Olenna pursed her lips. She looked at the two guards for a moment before she huffed and waved her arm for them to lead the way as she followed them. The two guards lead her through the halls of the keep. It was dark and miserable, and no one crossed their paths as they made their way down into the dungeons. "What is this?" Olenna asked, confused, the light so poor that she couldn't really see as they lead her through the corridors. She wrinkled her nose at the smell of damp as they walked deeper into the caverns. No answer came from the guards until they came to a complete stop, neither of them explaining anything as Olenna stopped behind them, confused. "What is going on?" Olenna demanded. She took a nervous step back, wondering what sort of trick her husband was playing on her this time. However, she was quickly stopped from leaving by two further guards behind her. "I am the queen. You can't do this to me," Olenna screeched as they took one of her arms and dragged her into the cell before her, her voice echoing in the dungeons before the cell was closed behind her as she was tossed inside. "Lady Mother," said a voice, one that made Olenna's blood run cold, and she stumbled back as she saw who was standing in front of her on the other side of the cell door. It had been 7 years since she had last seen Rhaenyra. She hadn't looked back after she had left her only daughter at Winterfell. She had not cared to write to her or speak of her once. Rhaenyra was no longer her problem. "How dare you come here? This is my home, my castle. You have no power here," Olenna stated. She would not bow to Rhaenyra, and she would not fear someone who had no power to punish her for her actions. Euron would not bend the knee to Robb or Rhaenyra. He wanted his own source of power that could only come from bringing the Dragon Queen to Westeros and restoring her to her throne. Rhaenyra stared at her mother. She had thought about what she would say when she saw her again after everything that happened, but now there was nothing that filled her mind other than pity. Proud Olenna Lannister was a pitiful sight to behold. She had escaped every attempt to capture her and witnessed the fall of her house. There would be no escaping this time. They had made sure of that. Euron Greyjoy is unlikely to survive the battle. His men had deserted him, and the last time he was seen, he was screaming like a madman. Yara Greyjoy has bent the knee. I am on. Now Queen of the Iron Islands, Rhaenyra explained calmly. She watched her mother, seeing the look of fury on her face as she turned as red as the gown that she was wearing. Despite everything that had happened, Olenna still dressed in Lannister red, a proud statement of the house that she belonged to, especially when she was one of the last members left after the war. Olenna gritted her teeth, her hands clenched at her sides as she stared at Rhaenyra, wishing she could wrap her hands around her pretty little throat. She could not believe that it was going to end like this. Could you really execute your own mother? Olenna taunted. She stared Rhaenyra down, knowing that it was not something that her daughter would be able to do. Olenna very much doubted that she would die this day. She didn't care what happened to Euron, as the ball was already in motion to see the Starks toppled from their position with or without her help. For crimes against the realm, for the murder of my father, for the protection of my children, I would do anything, Rhaenyra replied without emotion. She stared right back, knowing that she would do anything to protect her children from her mother. Olenna was a threat as long as she was alive. She would always be plotting against Rhaenyra and her family for winning the war that had seen House Lannister fall from grace. Covered in mud, surrounded by northern men, and the man that had betrayed him to sail off with Yara, Euron Greyjoy, gritted his teeth as he ducked and dodged through the fighting that surrounded him. His men were following one by one around him. The slaughter was immense, and he screamed, charging forward, his sword clashing with any man that dared cross his path. He planned on taking as many northerners down with him as possible. It was then that he saw Yara. His niece stood just feet from him, a sword in her hand, covered in mud as the rain poured down upon them as if the gods themselves were crying. Euron's hold on his sword tightened, raising it in the air to charge towards Yara to get rid of the only other claimant to his throne, his eyes focused on nothing other than her. It was there that he found himself at his end, a sword driven through his gut by a soldier that he didn't recognize, his eyes snapping away from Yara, who made no move to stop. What was happening? Her men converging on Euron, their blades sinking into his flesh over and over as she stood and watched. Her father had been many things, but there would always be those loyal to him, and what Euron had done was unforgivable to them. Breathing heavily as he staggered forward, Euron tried to make his way over to Yara, his sword still in his hand, as he tried to pretend that he was unaffected by the stab wounds that he had sustained. He gritted his teeth as he approached her, his arm barely able to lift his sword when he was finally in front of Yara, who didn't say a word to Euron as she drove her own sword into his belly, dropping him to his knees, staring down at the pitiful form on the man that had murdered her father. Yara didn't feel an ounce of regret as she slit his throat with her dagger, allowing Euron Greyjoy slump backwards into the mud.